The 90s. A decade of technological advancements that brought the internet into our homes and a vast number of video games to our TV screens. Characters of all shapes, sizes, and species grabbed our attention with their assorted abilities. But there was one who was heralded for his desire to collect golden rings at lightning fast speeds. He's the most well-known hedgehog in history, but his creation was initially meant to rival that of an Italian plumber. This is, of course, the story of Sonic the Hedgehog. The spiky splash of blue that became an icon for one of history's greatest video game manufacturers. Sega! And shaped the 90s home console war in a way that no other fictional character ever could. But before we delve into the details of this turbulent decade, we need to back it up just a few more years to get a sense of the video game market before our cobalt blue friend made his first appearance. Arcade gaming dominated the early 80s, but with the introduction and uptake of the home computer, this spelt trouble for the already struggling home console market. The video game sector saw a major crash midway through the decade, with market leaders Atari ahead of a long list of companies either filing for bankruptcy or otherwise splitting up their assets. With investors scared off and predicting the video game fad was over, the future looked bleak. That was until Japanese manufacturers Nintendo decided to take the plunge and enter the North American market, following their impressive sales record in Japan from their Famicom system. This sparked a revival in the market, and fellow Japanese manufacturers Sega were quick to join in with their own console, the Sega Master System. Both the Famicom and Master System proved to be a commercial success, but Nintendo overshadowed their home country rivals, outselling Sega by 6-1. The Famicom makers had the advantage of being able to transpose their already recognizable characters from the arcade onto their home console cartridges. We're talking about none other than gaming's original double act, Mario and his brother Luigi. Creating a sequel to their arcade game in the form of Super Mario Bros., Nintendo sold over 40 million copies, far eclipsing anything that the team at Sega could muster. Back at Sega HQ, brainstorming began as to how they were going to challenge Nintendo on a more level playing field. Sega also had a character they'd brought with them from the arcade to the home console in the form of Alex the Kid. But he wasn't proving anywhere near as popular as they would have liked, with his childlike design making him unappealing to the teenage market. And so, an open call went out to all Sega employees, welcoming pitches for a new flagship character to carry them into the new decade and drive sales for their new console, the Sega Mega Drive.
There was a big movement campaign to create Sega's mascot icon. And it was a company-wide effort that everyone could submit their ideas. And there were about 200 drawings or different characters submitted.
Many responded to the call, but only one person's pitch could be successful. Step forward, Naoto Oshima. Having been a character designer at Sega for 3 years, Naoto Oshima had impressed his colleagues with his work on the Phantasy Star series. Hearing that applications were open, Oshima did what any self-respecting character designer with the opportunity of a lifetime at their fingertips would do. He took a holiday to New York. This holiday had already been booked months before he'd heard about the opportunity at Sega, but the trip to the Big Apple soon took on a different approach, with Sega's main territorial focus being North America. Having made the 13-hour flight from Tokyo to New York, Oshima took in the grandeur of the famous Central Park. Armed with nothing but sketches of potential characters, they began to ask strangers as they walked by which character they liked the look of the most. His informal poll saw a certain Dr. Robotnik, that's Dr. Eggman to those of us outside Japan, come in second. But stretching out way in front was a character of much greater distinction, Mr. Needlemouse. Oshima believed the appeal of this character had something to do with the fact that it transcended characteristics like race and gender, and while plumbers, giant apes, and yellow pixel-eating dots were all well represented in the gaming market, it was difficult to think of any other famous hedgehogs that he would have to contend with. Returning to Japan, Oshima had posters and plushies made of his blue-quilled character and sought the help of his friend and fellow game designer Yuji Naka to help build a prototype game to bring everything to life. This precursor featured a very simple rolling blue ball that Naka was able to conjure up in a short space of time from other test games that he'd been working on. Presenting all of this to the heads of Sega, they were impressed and quickly agreed that this was the secret weapon they needed to challenge Nintendo. Their belief in this fact was so strong that they even set the duo to work straight away, giving their project the codename Destroy Mario. With the green light from Sega, Yuji Naka was about to give Oshima's character a game to play that would spark a cultural phenomenon. Yuji Naka was a prolific game designer at Sega, having worked alongside Oshima on the Phantasy Star series. He'd also been praised for his work in successfully porting and programming the Ghouls and Ghosts arcade game for the new Sega Mega Drive. With Oshima's invite, Naka worked as the lead designer on the production team, featuring 13 other developers. Ironically, Naka was a big fan of Mario, but he always found himself wanting a faster version of the game, desperate to add serious speed to the precision jumping.
I liken this to Super Mario Brothers that I had played many times. To play Mario from this point to this point took 30 seconds, but if I can go through the same place in 10 seconds, your skill increases. My desire was to play games much faster and have a better sense of accomplishment.
Working off this desire for fast-paced platforming action, the team felt the character's name needed to reflect this concept, and after a few were thrown about, including Japanese names such as Kohosuku and Raisupi, Mr. Needlemouse had been rebranded to the more globally appealable Sonic. Development began immediately on the platform game, with a key feature being Sonic's default speed matching the top speed of his rival Mario. Even at his slowest, Sonic couldn't be beaten by the Italian. Naka had said he wanted people to have the ability to learn levels slowly, and then zoom through them expertly once they'd learned the positions of enemies. However, in playtests, gamers elected to go as quickly as possible right from the beginning, prompting Yuji to introduce the gold ring system that would complement this playstyle by protecting Sonic from instant death. Taking almost a year to produce, Sonic the Hedgehog was ready for release in 1991, and Yuji and the rest of the development team were ready to reap the rewards of their work. With Sonic the Hedgehog's release to the Japanese market imminent, Yuji Naka knocked on the door of his boss's office, asking for a well-earned raise, with 7 years of loyal work for Sega under his belt, as well as a number of other top-selling games. However, sales projections for Sonic the Hedgehog were not promising, and Sega's new expectations were that he wasn't going to be the rival for Mario that they dreamt he would be. As such, a pay rise was off the table for Naka. Stunned at this revelation, Naka quit his job at Sega Japan on the spot, furious with his work being undervalued and underappreciated. He left Tokyo, driving back to his home city of Osaka. On the way home, however, he stopped by the Nintendo headquarters in Kyoto to see how long the commute from here would be to Osaka. He'd heard stories of other programmers quitting Sega and getting calls from Nintendo just a few days later, and Yuji was one of the best programmers in the business. While he was in the car park at Nintendo, Naka debated walking into their offices and asking for a job there and then. That was until a menacing security guard came out to see what he was doing there, prompting him to U-turn out of the car park and wait for the call instead. But the call from Nintendo never came. Instead, when the phone rang, it was Mark Cerny, now known as the lead architect of the PlayStation 4 and 5 consoles. Back in the 70s and 80s, Mark was working as a programmer at industry giants Atari, but after the video game crash in the 80s, he'd jumped ship, and was now heading up Sega America. He asked Naka to come over and visit their headquarters in Silicon Valley. With little else on his plate, he jumped on a plane to San Francisco and spent a few days exploring the Sega America headquarters. He thought it was one of the coolest offices he'd ever seen, with separate cubicles for every employee and automatic gates for your car. Yes, these really were some of the things that stuck out to Naka. He returned to Japan with a job offer on the table, and after some deliberation, agreed to move to America and work for Sega there. This was all on one condition, that he would not have to work on a Sonic sequel. Believing the projections for Sonic sales from Sega Japan, Mark assumed there would be no demand for a Sonic sequel anyway, and eagerly agreed to this condition. From their point of view, Sonic was merely their first attempt to bring a mascot to the table to rival the market presence of Nintendo. Their opponents had hit it big. They'd set the bar impossibly out of reach, with a mascot that was sweeping across the globe like wildfire. Sega felt that they'd tried, but fallen short. The team behind the game had poured themselves into the project and created something that they believed had the potential to topple Nintendo's titanic stature. Yet their excitement would quickly wane, with the realization they were working against the odds. If the shot callers had no faith in the project, what was all that work for? Given Sega Japan's pessimistic projections and their lack of support, one thing became clear. If there was any future for the Sonic franchise, it was sure to be a laborious one. After being burned once, Naka wasn't ready to be made a fool of again. Sonic was quickly being labelled as a failure by Sega, even before it had been released. But in the space of a few weeks, Sega's whole stance was about to change completely. From the time Yuji Naka had accepted the job offer at Sega America, to him landing in San Francisco, ready to start his new job, Sonic the Hedgehog had been launched in Japan and North America, to huge critical acclaim and massive commercial success.
As a marketer, we knew that we had something great in Sonic. We didn't have one thing that Nintendo did, and that was a lot of money. So we had to go and be smart, we had to be bold, we had to go and figure out different ways to go and do it. So we kept Sonic a secret until CES. A reporter from a major national magazine came up to me and said, "Super Nintendo has 32,768 colors. You've only got 512. What are you going to do about it?" So silently, I just motioned for him to follow me and walked over to a place in our booth where we had two large TV monitors. One had Sonic the Hedgehog and one had the new 16-bit Super Mario. And I said, "Which one has more colors?" I said, "It's not how many colors you have, it's what you do with them." Immediately he saw the difference, and that's how CES started for us.
Sega made a bold move to bundle Sonic the Hedgehog with their Mega Drive console for the Christmas period, practically giving the game away for free. This strategy paid off though, with Sega gaining control of the market back from Nintendo, with a 65% market share. Sonic was a hit, and Project Destroy Mario had succeeded, at least for the time being. Sega wanted more.
Sonic was appealing for a number of different reasons. First of all, he just has a beautiful simplicity to him. Clean lines, just a gorgeous set of colors, the blue and the red tennis shoes. But secondly, he really communicated the power of the game just by looking at him. When you see those red tennis shoes, you just assume he can run fast, and he did. And his spin attack made it appear as though nothing could defeat Sonic the Hedgehog.
But Naka had accepted the job in America on that one condition, that he didn't want to be involved in a potential follow-up to the game. Even with Sonic's immense popularity, he wasn't being compliant. When he was told to get to work on a sequel on his first day in America, he believed they were simply hazing the new guy. Realizing they were serious, Yuji Naka told them they could forget it. He was going back to Japan. Not wanting him to actually follow through on this threat, Mark Cerny opened negotiations and asked him what it would take for him to stay and work on a Sonic sequel. Naka's response was that he wanted it to be a two-player game, as he'd originally intended for the first game, but he was limited by the memory of the Sega Mega Drive cartridges. This sounded fair to Mark, and a new deal was struck to work on Sonic the Hedgehog 2. At this time, a number of former Sonic Team programmers made the switch from Sega Japan to America, following similar disputes over pay to the one that Yuji had. Over the next year, Sega America teamed up with Team Sonic back in Japan, and in 1992, Sega released the two-player game Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This was also the introduction of Sonic's fox-faced friend, Tails. Over the next few years, 5 new iterations of the Sonic the Hedgehog series were released for Sega's home consoles, introducing new characters with every game. One notable introduction was the fourth installment in the franchise, Sonic & Knuckles, with the brash character that we know today making his first appearance. Sega would continue to adopt the same sales strategy they'd used for the first Sonic title, bundling each new game with the Mega Drive. Lucrative profits were theirs, beating Nintendo's new console, the Super Famicom, in 4 consecutive Christmas sales periods. Sonic was the new household name that gamers couldn't get enough of. But the good times couldn't last forever, as a new player was about to enter the game. The Sega Mega Drive had been a huge success for Sega, but technology was moving fast, and Sony had announced their first entry to the home console market, the PlayStation.
The Sony PlayStation. Now see the outstanding technical capabilities of Sony's advanced video game system, and how game developers the world over can now create a stunning new generation of interactive entertainment.
Nintendo were quick to respond with their Nintendo 64, launching this with 3 games, including the very popular Super Mario 64. Both consoles gave users completely 3D gaming experiences that hadn't been capable on any console before, making this one of the biggest leaps ever in console development, and quickly making older generations obsolete. Sega responded with the launch of their 4th major console, the Sega Saturn, focusing on internet gameplay with their Sega Netlink attachment. However, they struggled to provide enough games that warranted purchasing the Netlink, with complicated hardware making game development difficult for their software engineers. At this point, Oshima and Naka had reunited in Japan and were working on a new franchise called Nights into Dreams, along with the rest of Sonic Team. This game featured an exciting new engine. Sega were keen to get a Sonic title released on the ever-struggling Saturn console, and so, alongside their new franchise, the developers worked with Sega to develop Sonic X-treme. This was destined to be the first fully 3D game in the Sonic series, but after difficult programming forced the development team to work up to 20 hours a day, the Sonic team passed off the workload to Sega America, so they could return their focus to Nights into Dreams. The troubles weren't over yet though, as new disputes arose between Sega teams in America and Japan, with America demanding that Yuji Naka let them use his game engine that he'd specifically designed for Nights into Dreams. Naka was adamant that he wouldn't let them use it, and just a few months later, Sonic X-treme was cancelled. He expressed his relief at the cancellation, saying that it would have severely damaged Sonic's reputation to put out the game in the state that it was in. In fact, the only Sonic titles released for the Saturn were remakes of older games from the Mega Drive, reprogrammed with only minor changes to be compatible with the new console. The only original title released onto the Saturn was Sonic R, a racing game that didn't give players the platform genre experience that had drawn them to the Sonic franchise in the first place. Sega's console market share had plummeted to just over 10% by 1997, with Nintendo and Sony owning the rest.
With Sega Saturn, we delivered a game such as Sonic Blast, Sonic R, the Sonic racing game. They did reasonably well, but it was a struggle for us to fight against Sony, and this was the very first roadblock Sonic had faced.
The Sega Saturn was deemed a commercial failure, and desperate to get ahead of the curve for the next generation of consoles, Sega released their Sega Dreamcast. Launching to the American market in 1999, sales were slower than ever, with Sony releasing their highly anticipated and frankly more attractive and powerful console, the PlayStation 2, just a year later. Nintendo also released their own GameCube a year after this, putting the final nail in the Sega console coffin. During this period, Sega did manage to convert the cancelled Sonic X-treme game that was originally destined for the Saturn and reprogrammed it for the Dreamcast. Released under the title Sonic Adventure, this finished as the Dreamcast's best-selling game and recouped many of the losses that Sega had suffered from their recent hardware failures. Sonic Adventure would be the final game in the franchise that Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima would head up for Sega. But this wasn't enough to save Sega's underperforming and overpriced consoles, and with Microsoft entering the console market with their first Xbox in 2002, Sega bowed out of the hardware race, and attention turned back to what they did best: games. The turn of the millennium had seen a major shift in the console market, with the recognized trifecta we know today of Microsoft's Xbox, Sony's PlayStation, and Nintendo's varied consoles coming to the forefront of the hardware battle. But Sega still had a world-class software development team, and crucially, a character with as much popularity as Mario. Collaborations began with Nintendo, releasing Sonic Adventure 2 for the GameCube, followed up by new Sonic platform games designed for the Xbox and PlayStation. Sega had planned a major release for Sonic's 15th birthday, but at this point, Yuji Naka, who was the last remaining programmer from the original Sonic team, left Sega for good, and direction was lost. Development of the anniversary game was rushed, and Sonic 06 became known as the worst Sonic game in history faster than it took to make it. Hardly the celebration that Sega had imagined. With Sonic's reputation faltering, Sega were forced to refocus their efforts, to work closely alongside Nintendo and their Mario franchise, aiming for the two characters to profit from each other's popularity. Prior to the Beijing Olympics, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games was released for the Nintendo Wii, and this collaboration of the two flagship characters proved a masterstroke. The game was regarded as the best Wii game of the year and sold over 10 million units in total, picking up a Guinness World Record along the way as the best-selling gaming character crossover ever created. Since then, 5 more games in the Mario and Sonic Olympics series have been released for the varying Nintendo consoles, including an updated version for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. Popularity remains high for these games, and for the foreseeable future, Mario and Sonic will continue to feature alongside each other. Sonic's journey is a remarkable one, initially born out of intent to defeat his rival Mario, to sharing a racetrack nearly 30 years later with this enemy he once swore to destroy. To date, there have been a staggering 91 video games released under the Sonic franchise, across many platforms, spanning everything from party to racing games. And the Sega flag carrier continues to feature on the 3 major consoles to this day, still programmed by the Japanese Sonic team. Although they weren't in charge for his questionable character design for the Sonic the Hedgehog film in 2020.
Meow?
And while this team may not still boast its original creators in Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima, their legacy for fast-paced gameplay remains Sonic the Hedgehog's trademark. With that, it's probably no exaggeration to say that Sega owes their modern presence in the video game market to these two programmers, with the franchise selling over 1 billion units since that very first game back in 1991. This has been Origins, I've been Emil Cole, and we'll see you on the next episode.